In 1987, I went to Peru to work with the late Fritz Riddell, California's original state archaeologist. Assisting Fritz on this expedition was Professor Makota Kota of California State University, Chico. Following his retirement from California State Parks, Fritz founded the California Institute for Peruvian Studies and soon returned to investigating the archaeology of the Peruvian South Coast, the area he had worked in during the early 1950s, when he was at Berkeley and married to the renowned Peruvianist Dorothy Menzel. This included the Acari River Valley, about 80 miles south of Nazca. In spite of the river, this is one of the world's most arid regions. Some areas are so dry that not even a cactus can survive there. I was thrilled to visit this area. I've talked about some of my Peruvian experiences in a few of my earlier podcasts. The archaeological history found on the south coast of Peru is beyond spectacular in terms of both the material culture and the state of its preservation. Unfortunately, much of it has been damaged by 500 years of looting, beginning with the conquistadores of the 16th century and continuing to the present. The archaeological sites have also suffered from the adverse effects of unregulated development. One of my most memorable experiences while in Acari was an archaeological survey that some of us conducted of a fairly large section of the local coast. It was actually quite remarkable. While in Acari, we stayed at the Hacienda Santa Teresita, a substantial home located at the edge of town and owned by the former patron of the valley. The owner spent most of his time in Lima, so his residence was made available to our crew as a base of operations. We lived there, and we had our lab set up there as well. Acari is situated about 20 miles inland from the coast. So, for our coastal survey, it was necessary to find transport. Fritz hired a local man to drive our 5-person crew to the coast and back each day. We did this for the better part of a week. The man who drove us had a small Toyota pickup with extremely bald tires. Most days, the truck had crated live chickens in the bed, and various other things taking up the space. 2 of the smaller members of the crew would crowd into the cab with the driver, and the rest of us would crawl into the back. Our driver would then speed us down the lonely Acari Highway to the absolutely desolate Pan American Highway that paralleled the coast. From there, we turned south and go a mile or two to what was then, and probably still is, a little hole in the wall known as Chaviña. I always rode in the truck's bed, hanging on to whatever I could and praying that we'd not blow a tire or crash some other way. There were a few small monuments alongside the highway where people had died in accidents. The one that most troubled me was a large memorial cross near the road with several smaller ones further away. I assumed it marked the place where a pickup truck, much like ours, had overturned, killing the driver and throwing those riding in back a good distance beyond where the truck came to rest. I would see those crosses every day, and the sight made me hang on even tighter, stinky chicken crates or not. Once we were in Chaviña, we'd say goodbye to our driver and then hike over the sand dunes and head west toward the Pacific. Chaviña was our jumping-off point for accessing the survey area out on the Playa de las Penuelas. Part of our routine was traversing a looted cemetery at the start and the end of every day. The unmarked cemetery was associated with the Inca Nazca culture, dating from about 2000 BC to about AD 600. The people of the Inca Nazca culture are known for their exquisite ceramics and textile arts. The area contained archaeological evidence of the more recent Inca culture as well. The Inca controlled the Acari area from about 800 years ago until the time of the Inca collapse in 1533. Many of the burials at Penuelas have been looted in recent years, and many more were looted before that. Locals call this ancient burial ground the Gourd Patch, due to the countless sun-bleached skulls that are visible in the sand. In fact, over 1,400 skulls were counted by Fritz Riddell and Dorothy Menzel in 1954. Because the looting had continued after Fritz and Dorothy had counted the skulls, there were quite a few more than 1,400 to be seen when I visited the site in 1987. The crew had to carefully pick its way through the burial ground in order to reach the beach where the survey transects began. We tread lightly and were careful not to step on artifacts or people. To do so required a complicated route to reach the other side. The state of preservation here was incredible. We saw things like wooden flutes, woven slings, a gourd container with 6 desiccated chilies, wood and bone sewing kits, a woven bag with natural medicines, and textiles with amazing geometric and naturalistic decorative designs. These were things that had accompanied the dead, only to be thrown away by the looters. I recall one mummy with a tunic bearing what appeared to be embroidered monkeys. I seem to remember some dolphins, too. In areas where the blowing sand had not scoured the corpses clean, the dead were still mummified. They were certainly more than mere bones. I remember a young girl with a red ribbon still attached to her braided hair. Like the man with the monkey-decorated tunic, she lived about 2,000 years ago. And there was an elderly woman I passed by 2 days in a row. She had been buried with a pouch made of alpaca wool. On the second day, I peered inside the bag and saw that it was full of plant material, things like roots and tubers. I wondered if perhaps she was a healer, skilled in the ways of medicinal plants. Sometimes we think we invented medicine, but of course we didn't. People had been curing one another for an exceptionally long time. Some of the mummies I saw at Penuelas had tattoos, primarily inked on the arms. Most of the tattoos I saw were abstract designs, but I do recall one man with representational designs on his arm. They caught my attention, and over the years I've thought a lot about them. Were they meant for others to see during this man's earthly life, or might they have been intended for the life that came later? Eventually I decided to get tattoos of my own. My own tattoos aren't intended for those I might come in contact with now. They're for another time. They comprise a celestial guide of who I am, where I've been, and what I've seen. They represent my belief system for transcending a world without words. At Penuelas, the dead had been ripped from their graves by generations of local archaeros, artifact thieves who dug up the graves and removed the outer garments of the dead in search of grave goods to sell. And before the huaqueros, the cemetery had probably been ransacked by treasure-seeking conquistadors. When graves were found, the looters tossed the human remains out, much like litter bugs discard their trash. Like the conquistadors before them, the huaqueros were primarily interested in locating gold and silver. In more recent years, though, they've also sought out elegantly decorated ceramics, specimens of which bring substantial prices on the world market. Everything else has been cast off, and now litters the sand. Beautiful textiles, wooden and bone tools, and the dead themselves, tossed away like worthless trash. Elsewhere on the Playa, we came across a recently looted cemetery, one that was much smaller than the cemetery that Fritz and Dorothy had documented in 1954. This smaller cemetery was unknown, so we set about recording it. With authorization from the Peruvian authorities, the 14 individuals found in the huaqueros' back dirt were collected and relocated to the Catholic University of Santa Maria in Arequipa. The university is where all of the archaeological materials and human remains resulting from Fritz's work in the Acari region ended up. The school had a program in archaeology, and several of their graduate students worked beside us in Acari, including Lidio M. Valdez, now a highly respected Peruvianist himself. Another of the sites we found on the Playa consisted of stone tools, and little more than that. The intent of our survey at Penuelas was to try and locate pre-ceramic sites, places where people had worked and lived prior to the introduction of ceramics. This site appeared to be just that. We observed no ceramics on the site's surface, but crude stone tools lay all about. We collected the tools for analysis, a project I worked on with Fritz back at the lab we had set up at the hacienda. Ceramics are thought to have been introduced to the peoples of ancient Peru by 1800 BC. If the site we found was in fact pre-ceramic, then it must have been thousands of years old. At the time, I thought the stone tool site was exceptionally old, perhaps dating back to the times of the late Pleistocene. As far as I know, that was never determined. Since that time, other early sites have been identified on the South American coast, including the famous Monte Verde in Chile. Most recent dating indicates that Monte Verde may have been occupied as early as 18,000 years ago. The site we found on the Playa at Penuelas may not have been that old, but it almost certainly predated everything else we saw there. But my most favorite archaeological site was another one we found out on the Playa at Penuelas. This was a small occupation site with broken ceramics, fragments of textiles, and numerous small corn cobs. Not far away, on a slight rise, I found a woven sling beside a pile of water-worn pebbles. The sling was made from the woven fibers of alpaca wool. Noting that the pebbles were the right size to have been used with the sling, I walked down the rise and out on the flat playa. In an area about a sling's throw from where I had found the sling, there were dozens and dozens of water-worn pebbles, identical to those I had observed beside the sling. It seemed obvious to me that someone had stood on the rise and practiced their skills at launching missiles. Or perhaps they had helped defend their community against aggressors. Prior to my trip, I had read as much as I could about Peruvian archaeology. I felt prepared to find and document archaeological sites, but nothing prepared me for the sight of the looted cemeteries. When the dead are first encountered by the looters, bodies are naturally mummified, but once the remains are discarded, the blow-in sand will strip the dry flesh from the corpses, leaving bones that turn white in the sun. I saw evidence of considerable looting while I was in Peru, and it was always shocking to behold. The violation of the dead and the destruction of the archaeological record is troubling. The huaqueros are just the tip of the iceberg, though, when it comes to the matter of who is at fault. It's the middlemen in Lima and the rich collectors in London and New York and Tokyo, among other places, who drive the market by their willingness to buy looted antiquities, no matter the price. But what the collectors are willing to pay at auction or in the black market pales in comparison to the price that the rest of us pay, as important elements of the world's cultural heritage are systematically consumed by some of the most selfish and barbaric of the ultra-rich. For example, look at what's occurred in Syria and Iraq in recent years, as illegally obtained artifacts flood into markets around the world. Rich collectors will buy those artifacts, regardless of the ethics surrounding their excavation. And sometimes, even if the profits are known to finance terrorism. Those who have studied world history will recall that this area, the Tigris-Euphrates River system, is considered one of the cradles of civilization. Indeed, the place where Western civilization began thousands of years ago. Ancient Peru was another such cradle of civilization. The architectural and artistic wonders that are found in the region's archaeological record testify to the grandeur that once characterized the area. Then the Spanish explorer, Francisco Pizarro, arrived with the conquistadors. The continued looting of Peru's rich archaeological treasures to satisfy the greed of powerful outsiders suggests that the conquest continues.